Hey folks, Shane here with Why We Do What We Do. Just dropping in to share a little bit of information about the Israeli-Palestine conflict that's going on right now. As part of the podcast, what we're trying to do is share some resources and share some facts about what might be going on. And so hopefully this is helpful for you to grow your knowledge about this conflict and hopefully learn a little bit about what's going on in this really complicated and unfortunate situation. So the fact today is going to be a little bit about where the Palestinian people are, which is currently they are mostly centralized in Gaza and the West Bank in the Middle East. This is an interesting area, mostly because up until 1948, there were multiple nations controlling this area. So the British were involved in kind of some of the controlling lands and some, as you could imagine, with England and the British being involved in a lot of stuff. So the British were involved in controlling some of the lands. The West Bank was ruled by Jordan. The Gaza Strip was ruled by Egypt. There was a war, and currently the Palestinian people are living under military occupation. So that's one of the major conflicts that's going on. Since 1967, the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are living under military occupation from the Israeli government. That is where we're at right now, and I just wanted to share that little bit of information. We are going to continue to share more, and obviously these are going to be bite-sized bits of information as we go, but we're going to share more information as we go, and we are also going to share a resource. This week, the resource we want to share is a documentary called 5 Broken Cameras. It came out in 2011. It's described on IMDb as a documentary on a Palestinian farmer's chronicle of his nonviolent resistance to the actions of the Israeli army. So this follows a farmer and his son. He gets his first camera. He's going to start kind of filming and starts seeing the Israeli government beginning to bulldoze olive groves and start to kind of build these settlements and take away some of the lands of the Palestinian people during this time. And so I think it's a powerful documentary. It's called 5 Cameras because every time there is a new camera, it is either shot or smashed or destroyed. And so it's just an example of really good nonviolent resistance in the face of extremism in that type of government rule. So it's called 5 Cameras. It's available now. You can check it out. And thank you for listening. We hope you enjoy the show.
You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your standing by host, Abraham.
And I am your pluralist host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about all the things that people do. And, when we started this podcast, we did sort of a lot of topics you might find in a Psych 101 class.
Yes. So I can't even say we. Actually, I was listening to the episode and apparently I was part of the team at the time, but I wasn't doing anything on the show. I think I might have been helping with stuff. So I did get referenced a couple times in the show, which I thought was funny in this particular episode. But many years ago, we covered the topic of bystander effect, which, was, I think, made famous by Seinfeld.
Sure. And a horrible story that we'll recount at the beginning of the episode when we replay our nostalgia episode. But all that is to say, this is a nostalgia episode. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Sometimes we do this format where we replay some of our older episodes and we then give an update, talk about what has happened since then.
Yes.
We'll replay the whole thing in its entirety, and then we'll sort of come back and talk to you more about that. But before we do that, we'd like to recognize that on this day, we are celebrating the Go for a Ride Day holiday.
Yeah, go for a ride. I like that. It's also the Humane Society Anniversary Day.
Oh, that's great.
That's fine. Yeah.
It's Love Your Freckles Day, particularly for Judy Blume fans.
Yep. Nice. At the time this is coming out, it's the day before Thanksgiving, so it makes sense that today is National Cranberry Relish Day.
Okay. It is also National Jukebox Day. Put a quarter in it. Play a song.
Yeah, but don't bully the jukebox. And don't play Freebird. That song's too long.
It's funny.
It's just mean. It's National Tie One On Day, which means you're supposed to put on your apron and start cooking for Thanksgiving, apparently.
That does make some amount of sense. Thanksgiving is tomorrow, in fact. So happy Thanksgiving as well.
Yeah.
It's also What Do You Love About America Day. And maybe that's Thanksgiving.
Yeah. And maybe that's a whole number of things. Or maybe it's few things. Who knows? Everybody's got their personal opinions on that.
It's true.
It's also World Antimicrobial Awareness Week.
That's great, because when we're talking about being around one another in these big gatherings, and we know that there's still a lot of diseases out there spreading, there's a lot of food going on around the holidays. So wash those hands, sterilize those dishes, wear a mask when it makes sense to wear a mask, do all that sort of things.
Yeah.
All that sort of thing.
Yeah.
All those sorts of things.
Don't be gross.
Don't be gross. Be clean so that nobody gets sick anymore.
Yes, I like that.
Okay, so let's jump into this real quick. As a quick reminder, we're talking about the bystander effect. I don't even know if that's a reminder. Did we say that's what we're talking about yet? I don't think we did.
Well, no, I think we did.
Okay, great. Well, we're talking about the bystander effect. And just a reminder of what that is, we're going to break that down as we replay this episode. But it's this theory that in an emergency situation, seeing other people around will discourage the observer from helping. So there's some kind of emergency, there's a lot of people in a crowd, and rather than one person or anybody running in to help, everyone kind of stands there expecting someone else to run into help, and nobody does. That's the idea of the bystander effect.
Going back and listening to this episode, I think that you guys covered it really well, actually.
Thanks.
And there's not really a lot to add in terms of corrections. I don't think that there's really any corrections I would have, because it's kind of a weird topic. But I do think that there are some points that I wanted to kind of further elaborate on from the episode that I think, based on some current research, some more recent research, that it's worth kind of diving into to show how complex this quote-unquote effect is.
So this episode came out on February 14th, 2018. And since then, there's been some sort of updates. Although one thing that we didn't include in the original one is this study, or this paper from Plotner and colleagues, which showed that children demonstrated the issue of the bystander effect. They specifically cite the issue being a result of diffusion of responsibility, which is kind of what it sounds like. The idea that if there's a lot of people that can be responsible, then nobody feels directly responsible, because that the feeling of responsibility is diffused among the crowd, if you will.
Right.
But based on the discussion, it would make sense that young learners might struggle with intervening because A, they've never been exposed to an emergency, or probably not one of that magnitude. B, they have absolutely no training in how to manage the emergency. C, they have absolutely no clues related to the experience to make a decision in that type of circumstance. And I would also say D, that they've probably likely been told to specifically not intervene in emergency situations. They have a history of being around authority figures and adults who are always responsible for taking part of an emergency.
Right.
And when they're observing one, they're sort of looking around for who's going to do something about this. I'm not supposed to do something about this. Adults do something about this. So I think there's lots of reasons to consider that the diffusion of responsibility is maybe not the relevant independent variable that has them not acting, and that we can look at contextual features of their learning history that most likely explain that behavior better.
And honestly, like, I think about a kid, like, let's say there's an emergency in a kindergarten class. If like some 4 or 5-year-old stands up and he's like, I got this, I'm going to be like, what is happening right now?
Yeah.
Like, what world am I living in that a 5-year-old is leading? I mean, not to say that they couldn't, but it's very unlikely they have like the real world experience and applications to safely navigate that type of thing.
Yeah, very much so.
But it's kind of funny to think about, though. It's very cute. It's very cute to see, like, think about like kindergartners navigating like an emergency. Oh, there's a fire.
Yeah.
Kind of going into more research, Leibst et al. In 2019, they used CCTV, or closed circuit TV. They used this footage to evaluate intervention tactics of bystanders, and actually found that bystanders were more likely to intervene if they had a clear social relationship with that person. In that situation, they were more rapidly intervening. They were more likely to intervene than if it was a stranger or somebody that was kind of an unknown or unfamiliar. So the stronger or the closer the relationship, they were more likely to intervene. But they also go so far as to cite that the primary challenge of any sort of research on bystander effect is related to setting. So a lab setting cannot accurately replicate those actual emergency situations, specifically because nobody's at risk.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody is actually at risk, so they can't simulate somebody being at risk. Like, I mean, you mentioned before the study where they would like start kind of filtering smoke under the door and see how quickly people would respond and all that. But
right.
When it comes to people actually being at risk, there's nobody at risk. And so the effects are going to be skewed because it's not an actual emergency.
Yeah. You just can't you just can't get through I or B, the approval, to like create an actual panic in like a social environment.
Yeah, right.
And if you tried to, like, unless you had engineered it pretty carefully, like most people are going to see right through it. And even if you have engineered it pretty carefully, they're probably going to see right through it. And if you've done it so carefully that they don't see right through it, again, you're probably getting in trouble for doing something unethical. So
right.
It has to be more post hoc and observational than it is experimental.
Right.
And it's just the nature of the thing. Like, it's just how things like that work. In 2021, Ketry and Marks discussed the effects of bystander sexual assault prevention programs, and this goes on to confirm what we had said before, that knowledge and experience about a situation is more likely to reduce bystander effect. So, simple education campaign is going to at least mitigate this to some extent, in the extent to which it actually exists, which we will talk more about when we replay this.
Right. Absolutely. So that's just kind of a little bit about what research. I mean, there's a couple other studies out there, but they all kind of confirm the same thing, where it's usually relationship has an impact, experience has an impact, all of those things that kind of really make it so it's like maybe bystander effect is not a thing. Maybe it's just like lack of experience.
Yeah. All right. So why don't we bystander effect? Let's go ahead and jump into this discussion. I guess first we'll do some ads and then we'll do the discussion.
Sure.
Hello, this is Abraham.
And Ryan O.
And so this is why we do what we do. And I'm going to start off, as I like to do sometimes, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions.
Ooh, all right. Let's hear it.
Okay. Well, just one to start. So first, Ryan O., have you ever been in a situation, I mean, you personally, really, where you saw something horrible or maybe an emergency happening in real life? Like, has that ever happened to you?
Yes.
Well, let's talk about it.
Okay. So one time that I recall, this is unfortunately happened a couple times, like I've driven up on car wrecks.
Okay.
And so I can think of 3 distinct ones. And one, I was like way too little. And that was just not really my responsibility to kind of do anything.
Which we'll talk about a little bit more.
I remember my dad. Yeah. I remember my dad stopping and whatnot. One, when I was driving back from grad school, actually, and I stopped, but there was a bunch of other people that stopped and kind of helped out.
Okay.
And then there was one other one that I can distinctly remember as well. So like I had those sort of things happen.
And what did you do when you were in the situation? Let's go to the third one.
So the third one, I've got as close to like stopping and then like calling 911, but I was not there in a situation to where like I was actually like helping somebody like immediately.
Okay.
Like hands on. Have
you ever been in a place where you did have to like help someone hands on?
Yes, I have. But like It was primarily usually like when I was working in some sort of setting in which I was providing active treatment.
I see. Right? Okay. So that may be a little bit different than what we're talking about today. Yeah. So one thing that has been noticed is that when there is a large group of people, often, I mean, you think of like a crowded street in an urban area or something like that, or even maybe in a mall, and some kind of emergency takes place where some kind of intervention is needed, either someone's being attacked or they're having some kind of medical emergency. What has been noticed is that relatively few people will jump in and help in the situation like that when they're in a big crowd. However, if there's only a few people around, maybe only 1 or 2, maybe smaller than that, but the smaller the number, the more correlation there is, the more likely that someone in that group is to jump in and offer their assistance in some way. Okay. And there have been a lot of infamous examples of this happening. And so this has become known in social psychology as what's called the bystander effect. And I mean, it is what it says that it sounds like, right? Is that you're someone who's a bystander, you are sort of observing a thing that's taking place, and rather than intervening, you either watch or you go away, or you do something other than help, right? Yeah. And there are some reasons that might happen, but
yeah, I think the ones that are probably most relevant and people can probably relate to most quickly is like you'll see something tragic happening on TV and you'll see a ton of people filming as opposed to helping.
Oh yeah, right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's been some movies have sort of used that and how they portray emergency situations as well. And so, yeah, this episode, this is the why do we bystander effect? And as we'll see, I'm going to ask the question instead, why don't we bystander effect? And so really what we're going to be talking about, and we're going to get into when this does take place, but this might actually be more of an exception than a rule, or they happen in a more complicated way than just the size of the group?
Yeah. So my experience is I feel like I could say I've been on both ends of the spectrum of like helping or sitting and watching.
Okay.
One did come to mind, something at work where it was so I work in a place in which there can be crises quite frequently, as our definition, and like we have very good systems around that. But my role doesn't partake in handling those now, but everybody's trained to jump in and get involved. But this one was like really outside of the typical sort of ones that we deal with. And we were all in a meeting, and quite a few of us have all been extensively trained on how to respond to those sort of things. And everyone sat there for a second before someone kind of took off. So I guess there's been both ends of the spectrum I've definitely experienced.
Okay.
So in general, it's like this, we experience a situation where something horrible, frightening happens and you just don't move, right?
Yeah. You might just watch, you might like try and escape. I mean, it sort of depends on the situation, but yeah, it is doing something basically other than providing assistance or jumping into that situation.
Yeah. So I've seen this being brought into and kind of like overextended sometimes, or properly maybe extended. I don't know. I guess we'll find out as we get more into this, like into workplaces. So like that might be people actively performing CPR in the public, and like people responding to different types of emergencies in hospital settings, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So essentially what happens is that there seems to be that there's a decreased likelihood of someone actually acting in those situations. And this is talked about as this like diffusion of responsibility, which is to say that if there's a large enough group around, everyone in the group, according to this idea of diffusion of responsibility, feels slightly less responsible for intervening because there are so many people that it's sort of like that responsibility is spread among many people, or just whatever the situation is. At least it's not me if I'm in, if I'm there, or if it's not you. And it's that sense of I'm not responsible for dealing with this because there's so many other people here. Someone else is going to be able to do that. There are some other reasons that people might sort of justify not jumping in on a situation that looks like there needs to be an intervention. And one of them is kind of linked to this idea of the responsibility is you might not know what's going on. It might be very confusing to see, people who are friendly with each other might get in sort of a scuffle or some kind of fight that's not really an altercation. They're not actually trying to hurt each other. And so you don't know, like you can't necessarily look at a situation and know right away whether or not it is an emergency, whether or not intervention is warranted in that situation. You have to comprehend that that's what's going on in order to make a decision to act, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another one is that if you feel like it's an emergency where you don't have the kind of competence needed to intervene. So for example, if you've never seen someone have a seizure and you've never been trained on how to respond to someone who's having a seizure, you might look at that and say like, I'm going to do more harm than good. Right. And like, I know what's happening. It's not that I don't understand it. I'm not confused about the situation, but I have absolutely no idea what I could possibly be doing right now.
You feel a lot less competent in the situation.
Exactly. Or similarly to that is you don't know what you could possibly be doing, especially if it's something where you are maybe slightly removed, where it's like it's across a busy intersection, or it's somewhere where you can see what's happening, but you sort of feel helpless. You don't really know what you could be doing to try and intervene and what's going on. People are far away, or they're on, you maybe can see out a window something's happening below you. It's difficult to know exactly what you can do. Another one that I've thought of is we're in a particular time in history, I guess, where people will do sort of performance art pieces out in public that might look like an emergency, but they're really more part of an art. And it would be unfortunate to go tackle someone who is doing a performance and then try and help them when they were trying to maybe communicate in some way via their art form. And I mean, it overlays with some of the things we've already discussed. You don't really know what's going on. You're not really sure what to do. And this might not even be an emergency, right? And then another thing that I thought about and has been talked about is if you trying to intervene just means that there's going to be one more victim in that situation. It's, if there's really literally nothing that could be done. If you see I thought of an example of a burning building. Now, that might not be a great example because there might be some things that you can do in that situation. But I mean, if you see something, someone's getting attacked by a shark, like, do you jump in the water and try and wrestle them away from the shark? Because what's probably going to happen is the shark has 2 lunches instead of 1. You know what I mean? Rather than it. So you really don't even necessarily help by going in and trying to do some kind of intervention in that situation, because like you don't have the capacity. And that again goes back to feeling helpless and what to do, or unclear on what to do. So it's just difficult that there's a lot of things that might be going on rather than just, well, there's a lot of people here, I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah. So there was one infamous example.
Yeah.
Kitty Genovese.
Yeah. Or
right?
I thought I heard it Genovese. I don't know.
I heard the others from, I mean, I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
I guess I heard that from a few different sources last night when I was like finishing up my notes.
I'll trust you then.
Yeah. So do you want to describe that situation?
Yeah. So this was back in the 60s. Kitty Genovese was coming home late at night. I think she worked at a bar. It was about 3 a.m. or something. So she comes home and she's attacked in the parking lot of her apartment building. Again, very, very late at night or early in the morning. However,
the parking lot or the street?
I think it was a parking lot.
I was told the street.
No, maybe it's the street.
My point was I've seen both.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, it's unclear. Maybe we're unclear at least. So anyway, she was only about 100 feet away from the door to her building. That's maybe the relevant feature.
Yeah.
So she was on her way there. She was attacked. And when this was originally reported, it was reported as there being, a bunch of witnesses and nobody did anything. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you can generally assume that if it's 3 a.m., there's probably not going to be a bunch of witnesses, regardless of what's going on. But it was actually the case that if you look at the police reports, there were only a few people that actually heard anything at all. Of the few that heard what was going on, only a few of them could even see what was going on. Of the few that could see what was going on, only a few of them could really perceive that this was actually some kind of an emergency. And of those people who could see this and perceived that it was an emergency, at least one person immediately shouted out of their apartment to the person who was attacking. They were on a higher story, I believe. So they yelled out their window, and at least somebody did call the police. And this all happened relatively soon after she was attacked. And when that person yelled out the window, the attacker did in fact leave. So the police, I think what I read initially believed that this was mostly just a domestic dispute and didn't really immediately respond to the situation. The attacker eventually did come back, but at that point, Kitty had sort of made her way to the door, which was locked, and nobody could really see her there, and she was too weak to make a lot of noise. And also, you're thinking 3 a.m. and most people are asleep.
Yeah.
So the attacker did finish killing Kitty at that point. But I mean, this just kicked off this wave of research and sort of social psychology, which you can jump into that.
Yeah. So what I read was that and we just need to underlie this with like, this is a horrible situation that was like, a case study essentially that turned into this whole line of research. Like, I don't want to forget the person behind this.
That's fair.
Yeah. So I read that the New York Times reported over 30 people had apparently heard or saw to some extent of this. And that's kind of like
completely incorrect.
Yeah. And that was kind of the basis, I think, of this line of research was a lot of people had saw something happen and didn't do anything. Like, boom, that's where this line of research like started off.
Yeah, basically.
And so,
man, can't you just hear like the news report in like a 60s era voice? They're like, woman attacked in her apartment building in the morning. 30 onlookers did nothing.
You're pretty good at that.
Thanks. Somebody better jump in and do something right now because emergency, there are ads. Whew. Crisis averted. We're back.
Yeah, so that's what happened. And I think it was Darley and I don't know how to say the last name, Latani.
I don't know.
I'm going to go with Latani. I'm probably butchering that and I'm so sorry. But they, in 1968, came out with like the original bystander effect study. Some of the things that I pulled from this was they had set up, and there's been a lot of different studies looking at this and replications and like kind of alterations. So I'm going to speak a little and like overgeneralizations here, but largely what was found is as if you had set up a situation that kind of mimicked this. So typically they were, you come in and someone instructs you to do something. I think the main original one and one that's been replicated the most was you come in, you're sitting down and you're listening to something. And all of a sudden the person starts to state they have some sort of health implications that are going on. The question was, how long does it take for that person to get up and go notify the experimenters that like, hey, I think something's going on here.
So the people who were in the audience they didn't know that was part of the experiment.
Yep, correct.
Got it.
And so they are typically in like a room sitting by themselves. And one of the variables that are altered is like how many people are in that room with them as Confederates, essentially. Like they know what's going on. And the main person there doesn't know that those people are Confederates. Hence Confederates. And so that's kind of the typical situation. Some alterations are like they might be sitting in a room and working on some paperwork and some smoke starts to come from underneath a door, right? So there's some alterations and it's been studied even I think a little bit publicly through those sort of like mimicking those performance arts that you gave us an example of. And so in general, with all of these sort of different ways in which you can look at this, the number of people in the room or in the situation was the number one factor that people looked at. And largely, if you're alone, you're going to respond in a way and such you go tell somebody and you like say, hey, this is a problem the most. But if you have more people in the room, that's going to diminish over the number of people there. So the original study was like alone. It was somewhere around 81% of the time people within 6 minutes would tell the experimenters like, hey, something's going on here. I think that you should go check out. And when it was 2 people were in the room with that person, it dropped to 60-ish% of the people actually did something within the 6 minutes. And then with there 5 people in the room, it was around 30% or so of those people did something in those 6 minutes. Does that make sense? Okay. So imagine that just kind of like generally is seen in this research. Now, when we talk about research and we see these consistent patterns over time, we're like, what do we usually do? Like, we're like, hey, this is something that's being replicated and kind of seen, right? Like there is some sort of effect here, right?
Yeah.
And so there's different ways in which this was interpreted. One of the main ones that I saw is that there's these various rules that we form, and it's assumed that people make these rules. And I don't know where like they're getting these rules from. It's like these social norms, I guess, that are just like made up in our head and everyone agrees to all of a sudden.
I mean, obviously we've talked in other episodes that they can come from so many different places and how we're raised and our experiences with those types of situations, our level of training, what the general context is. But I mean, just generally sort of speaking, where those rules come from, I think is going to be, without having the data in front of me, we can always sort of say this is going to be at least part of the culture.
Yes. And so the way in which I saw it, so either the researchers or the people talking about the research generally would describe it in the sense of like, there's 2 types of rules, like the we should help rule versus the we should sit around and do what everyone else is doing rule. And what I guess I was bringing up is like, I don't know where these rules are coming from per se, but that is the description of like, oh, I guess that's like their end goal. Their end thing is like, oh, we have these rules. And when we form these rules, that's the explanation of why this event's happening. And that's not good enough for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And also it's one of those things where that's just sort of an interpretation of the data that doesn't have a control or any real experiment to show that that's what's going on. And they didn't isolate that variable. So it was more of just a hypothesis about what could be taking place without data to back it up. And data in this situation would be pretty difficult to collect, which we'll be talking about data in an upcoming episode and how difficult that is to collect. But yeah, there were some things that you actually sort of brought this up, but to point out, so one thing that we said about the bystander effect, it's not just the fact that people don't do anything, but also maybe how long it takes for them to intervene as part of it. But then there's also a really important caveat in here in terms of how this research was actually conducted.
Yeah, so it's always very important in like how was your design actually set up and what questions we were asking and what were you doing and what weren't you doing as well. I think the what weren't you doing is sometimes like it's not dropped in there, right? And so
that can be really important in understanding maybe why the results turned out the way they did.
Yeah, and I think that was, if I can, I guess be the person to say, like I think that was kind of overlooked for a while in these research lines. And so there was one interesting thing that was done by Fisher et al. 2011, where they kind of looked at the different research that had been done, and they kind of looked at whether or not the people, the Confederates, were told to be passive and instructed to be passive, kind of like bystanders and watching and not do anything, versus be active and actually like initiate or like go with the idea of like we should be helping in these situations.
Got it.
And that provides exactly like pretty much the complete opposite effect when people were told to be active as these Confederates in these situations. And so what's very interesting to me is that it's no longer really then the bystander effect. If you tell these Confederates to be active, it's kind of like the helper effect. Like you see the opposite effect happening here.
So basically what you're saying is that if they told the people who were observing, or they were going into a situation where there was going to be an emergency, if they had given them the instruction beforehand to watch and see what happens, to be passive basically, that they were then less likely to respond. And in a way, they were helping out the experimenter by following their instructions, versus if they were told to do something, then they would jump in and do something.
Yeah.
So it's almost like if the bystander effect were a real problem we were seeing everywhere, then a basic inoculation would be to just get on the news and or have the White House tweet out to the American people and say, if you see something, do something. And then boom, you've got it cured. Everyone who sees that tweet is going to go take care of it.
Yeah. So the original idea was that there was some sort of diffusion responsibility that was occurring. And then it kind of shifted into, I saw another explanation was like, oh, you have these different rules that people are conforming to. And then this one kind of proposed like maybe it's a level of uncertainty and we need to dive into uncertainty. Like how certain or uncertain are we in a certain situation? Which again doesn't provide a super thorough like thing for me. I'm not like, personally happy of like, oh, it's uncertainty. That's what's going on in these situations.
Yeah, that'd be a hard one to test out as well.
But it like was a really good way to look at this sort of data, like what's actually going on, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
In these situations. And so I guess that's my summary and understanding of some of the different social psychology approaches to understanding this phenomenon.
Well, there was another one that I read about that I thought was pretty interesting, was a social psychology researcher. He also sort of believed that there was more going on to this bystander effect. And he put forth a hypothesis that when people were in a group and they knew the other people of the group, that really the social context inside of that group dynamic would work as a cue for taking action, for being responsible. And so he set up some studies where people could see who was being a bystander and who was contributing to a situation, looking at like who, and I think he did it virtually, so they had to like type something in on a computer. Mm-hmm. And so basically you could sit there and do nothing, but it would show that you sat there and do nothing. So at the opportunity to respond, a lot more people jumped in and responded. Then when he took away that people could see who you were, if you just had a camera pointed at you, I might be remembering this slightly differently than how he did it, but it was just interesting to see. It was something about if there was a camera pointed at you or something that again facilitated, that worked as a cue for people were more likely to take action as a cue of I have a social responsibility in this context. And so again, it's not just that the number of people predicts, it's sort of what the context of that situation means to the person who's experiencing it. There's another, changing gears a little bit, is that, so we've talked about the fact that there was this original sort of idea about what the bystander effect is and how prevalent it is and what it actually looks like when it's played out. And then we've talked about some of the considerations around that in terms of what other kind of variables might be important in understanding why people are likely to be a bystander in situations. But then there's also this other angle of why do people do these, super heroic things? Why do people jump in? And if the bystander effect is that prevalent, it shouldn't make sense that you see people who will willingly put themselves in harm's way to help another person, again, in large group settings. I recently heard a story that was on one of the podcasts I listened to, where there was a guy who's on a subway platform. And if you are in an urban area where you have subways, you know how incredibly packed those places are with people. They're very full in the middle of the day. And someone who was on the platform had a seizure, fell onto the tracks, and this guy who was there with his daughters, he jumped onto the tracks and covered this person with his body to basically put him out of harm's way of the oncoming train. And they were both okay. He basically just stopped him from flailing about and getting himself run over. And they ended up being okay. But it was, the fact that he responded immediately in this situation in a large group of people, that just shows like there might be this bystander effect here and there, but like you also see the opposite of that. You see like the people there's a lot of people around and people immediately jump in and take action. There was another story I have about when I was working with an individual with an intellectual disability, and this particular individual had some behaviors that were a little bit dangerous, both to themselves and others. And we were instructed to do a temporary physical restraint in the immediate events to prevent the onset of harm. And what that looks like essentially is restraining their arms so that they can't hurt other people. Well, we were working on a socialization program with this individual out in the community, and he escalated really fast, and we implemented this procedure. And immediately upon doing so, we were accosted by all of these people around us. So, what are you doing to that person? Leave him alone. And so we had to sort of both try and keep that person safe, ourselves safe, and give them we carried information cards on us that said what we were doing and all that sort of stuff. And nevertheless, people were calling the police and all that sort of thing. And we had to go through and give our account of the situation and what had taken place. And we were able to get out of there safely. Everyone was, but that was just another situation where in a public place, immediately 5 people were there, jumping into what they perceived to be some kind of emergency, where I guess they thought we were mauling some kid in a parking lot for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that people were worried about that, and it's actually cool to see that response from the public, right?
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. Like, it was great that you see those kind of things that people are willing to jump in.
Yeah. I've been in similar circumstances with different people for similar reasons, right? Like you're working with a client of some sort.
Right.
And I've had someone claim that they were an FBI agent before. And I was like, well, I'm pretty sure like I need to see some sort of form of identification to like, be actually like, like you can't be just claiming that. The guy disappeared before the cops actually showed up because we called the cops ourselves as a part of the process.
Yeah.
And yeah, it gets really messy really quick.
Yeah.
Really quick.
Absolutely.
Messy in the sense of like there's just a lot going on. There's a lot to process, delegate, understand, calm down, everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if it's too early, but I think that one thing that largely goes into this is have you had explicit training under these circumstances, right?
Right.
Like the conditions themselves. Like I feel like if I were to overgeneralize, like somebody with military background would probably be a little more responsive in general than somebody just out of high school, right?
Yeah, and actually, I had made a note in here that I was thinking, what if there were like an EMT convention where you have a bunch of like trained medical professionals, and right outside there's like some kind of medical crisis that takes place. You're gonna have 5,000 people descend on that situation immediately.
Yeah.
You know, I just thought that'd be a funny.
Yeah.
Again, counter argument, and mostly just to highlight the point of it's not just the number of people. Like there's more to it than that.
So this is a good segue. One thing that I had found on kind of a more recent-ish post, I think it was 2015, on Psychology Today, was Rosemary Sword and Philip Zimbardo posted an article talking about their kind of angle, and it seems like they were trying to coin their own term, or at least talk about it in a different way, and they called these effects of people not really moving around, it was known as pluralistic ignorance. And the idea here is when the group's majority privately believes one thing and mistakenly assumes that most others believe the opposite. And so that was what they suggested. And what I largely saw, I don't know what you found, was people were trying to create training programs and like awareness strategies around like, hey, we just need one person to start acting in those situations. Did you find something similar?
Yeah, absolutely. And have been in situations like that. And, basically what I've seen sort of recommended, as you just said, was that it's the whole going back to that if you see something, say something sort of thing.
Yeah.
You really only need, 1 or 2 people. There was randomly one time I was running an errand. It was probably 9:00 at night or so. And there's an underpass of a freeway that's relatively close to my house. And for some reason, there was a car that was entirely on fire underneath the underpass. It wasn't even on the road. It was off the road, but it was completely engulfed in flames. And so immediately it called the police, and they said, oh yeah, we've had like 35 calls about this already in the last 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So they knew what was going on. But yeah, that was the general recommendation being that. But I mean, you do tend to see that people will do that anyway in a lot of circumstances. And there also can be the effect of this pluralistic ignorance where you see it and say, well, someone else probably already called about that. Well, and more often than not, when I see an emergency situation, I'm catching it when people have already responded or are in the act of responding to it.
Yeah.
So that's not like, I'm not claiming ignorance that someone else is going to do it. I'm seeing them doing it.
Yes, exactly. And that was what I was describing when I was talking about the car wrecks that have like been seconds from like, or seen, like there's already so many people involved. I've learned to ask certain questions, I guess, of like what's being covered. And if everything's being covered, then I do kind of step back from the situation. But yeah, so I've seen a lot of people touting like, oh, we just need one person. Zimbardo said he launched a program, but then I clicked the link and it was dead. So I assume that's not happening anymore. But I wouldn't know because it was just a dead 404 screen on a page.
Okay.
So,
updated in 2001.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Yeah. Don't leave websites empty. It costs like $12 to like leave a page that says, you know, like we're no longer doing this.
Right.
But I'm being picky. All right. So what are some other views as to like why this happens? Like, what do you think?
Well, okay, so let's go ahead and start with the description of the fact that this can happen. There can be a situation where there's a large group of people, and part of the consideration as someone who's a part of that group is that there's a lot of people here. Someone else will do something. I'm not in a good position to do this. I don't understand what's happening. There could be a lot of things that are going on, but this can be a situation that happens, and because, at least partially because there's a large group, nobody reacts. Okay. The extent to which that occurs seems to be not really that well understood. There's a lot of people who are still doing research on this. A lot of research has been done on this, some showing exactly the opposite of this effect, depending on the circumstances. Another thing I think that's really useful to consider is how this might vary across cultures. This one, the Kitty Genovese story, was here in the United States, but if you're in a culture maybe where group participation is a lot more important and more heavily emphasized, then it's possible that you never see something like the bystander effect, right?
That was something that our own Shane Spiker commented on the post that we put up on Facebook about this. So his thing was, what about a brief discussion on the flight or flight freeze and kind of like how this may be impacted by culture, legality, and those sort of things?
Yes, which I have a thing about the flight freeze in a second. Cool. I think
so. Culture comes into play. I personally like understanding the differences between cultures and like just like it's hard to sort out. Like, yes, there's effects, I guess is my statement,
right?
But in my position, but holy cow, is that like a lot of data to sort out and really understand?
It is, and I mean, it's also easy to just say, oh, it's just the culture, and have that be sort of an easy scapegoat to answer a lot of questions. Mm-hmm. And so I think to maybe put it in terms that make a little bit more sense, it's to say that having or living in a particular setting where the people around you are likely to favor certain types of behaviors and to discourage or punish other types of behaviors. That's sort of what we mean when we're saying that there's a culture that exists. And yes, there definitely needs to be more said about that to understand how that really plays a role, and whether we're just sort of saying culture to sound like we know what we're talking about, or whether there are really good studies to show that yes, this does in fact change across cultures. It's just important to consider that just because this has shown up in certain situations, you shouldn't, I think, just assume that it will then exist as a product of being a human being. So it's basically, it's just more complicated than the fact that if the group is large, someone's unlikely to help. It's really, I think, worth considering what each person is experiencing psychologically when they're in a situation as a bystander.
Okay, yes, perfect. So we've talked in the past, I think it was the memory episode, there's different cues, right? And
right,
all of us can respond to cues in different ways. Like we're affected by different, like it's evolving and always changing.
And
right?
those are going to be different for each person, and they might even change for each person as they go through life experiencing new situations. Yeah.
So I brought this up earlier that like there it might be an untypical condition that we're not used to, and there's different cues going on, and we just do. You highlight on it too. Like we don't know how to react in the situation, right?
Well, and yeah, I mean, hopefully you're not in a world where you're just constantly seeing emergency after. I mean, there will be some professions where that's the case, but for most people, you're going around. You're not just living in a world where it's nonstop emergency. So yeah, it's a totally different situation. And as you said, that's not a cue that's really strong because most of us don't have a lot of learning around that cue.
Yeah. So one understanding of like why this happens is I would say everybody individually has a different set of reactions to different cues, and those things have been shown to be learned and can adapt over time. And that's why we have things like training, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like on-the-job training and refresher training. And like I feel like life is just a continual kind of refresher. And
sure,
like every time I go to sit down to edit video right now, like I relearn things and like I have to kind of get used to it again, right?
Piggybacking on this idea of training, the experiences you have up to that point are your training. So for example, I live in a neighborhood where at 2 a.m, it's not uncommon to hear people like screaming and yelling at each other, and people are up really late, and you hear, cars go screeching by and stuff like that. And it's just, that's a neighborhood where that sort of thing happens. So my training living in that situation is those types of cues are not emergencies, because it's only a small handful of times have they been emergencies, and there is a way to sort of tell the difference, at least for us. But for the most part, those things that are not emergencies there would be perceived as emergencies for people who didn't live in that type of situation.
My neighborhood, and granted we live like 2.5 miles away from each other, is maybe max is the complete opposite. It is perfectly quiet. And
right.
If anything's going on, everybody's out of their house, like looking at like what's happening.
Yeah. And so another thing to consider is that just thinking about you yourself, you as the listener, you, Ryan, and me, myself, you might do the exact same thing by yourself in a crisis situation as you would do in a group in a crisis situation. And so it's not the fact that you're in a group that's going to necessarily change your response, but the context of that situation and how you or me or, the listener relates to that situation.
Yeah. So I largely was, I guess growing up kind of like I was like the super quiet kid, wouldn't do much like that. And like
me too.
Getting into,
now we talk all the time.
Yeah. And getting into psychology and like specifically getting some training in crisis situations. I now feel like I step up to those sort of things quite often, and it's the complete opposite. And it's because these cues, I have a totally different training and experience with now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel more like I am aware enough of the type of situations that might occur that I would have the competence to do something meaningful in those situations. Yeah.
I'm sure you're tired of listening to us by now. Let's take a quick pause and listen to the refreshing voice of ads. All right, right back into it.
So another one is just, and we sort of talked about this earlier, but a way of considering a view of how you might perceive these situations is the kind of rules that you are already sort of following in your normal everyday life. And so just to sort of give you an example, you don't necessarily think about this, but one rule is that you tend to not walk right into someone, but you kind of veer around them. And there are reasons for that rule to exist. It's more efficient usually to go around them. It is considered rude to walk right into someone's face. Another rule is parking in the lines in a parking lot. I know there are many people who violate this rule, but for the most part, if you go to the parking lot, the majority of cars are parked between those lines. That's not a rule you sit down and think about and look at those and go, I wonder if I should park between those lines that are right there. It's something that we just sort of follow automatically. And those rules can reach into our language in how we are interacting with situations that are these emergencies, even the ones that we don't really think about in the moment.
Yeah. And I guess the area of language and like rules that I read up on, like I haven't looked at that recently, but I don't know of a lot of extensive research in that area. Do you? Like using that framework to understand language and rules, like in this particular situation.
I actually know you're right. I haven't looked at specific research and how people bring rules to that context.
Yeah.
Aside from how as you sort of said, the active passive one, because if you're someone who's gone into a situation and been told either be active or just watch, that is a sort of implicit rule in that situation that you'd be following. Now, that was not specifically set up to study rules by virtue of them being rules, but to study the influence of the experimenter on the participants, right?
Yeah, if someone's looking for like a thesis or dissertation, there it is.
Yeah,
Or an entire life of research.
Yeah, some kind of research project. Go for it.
So one other thing that I found, and this relates to Gina on Facebook commented. So we put out a blast for like, hey, this topic's upcoming. What do you want us to cover?
Oh man, and thank you guys for your responses. We got
Yeah.
some just really wonderful ideas and responses from the community. So thanks.
Yeah. So Gina Richards, she said, does organizational behavior management, which is an area that I don't think we've talked about yet. We maybe have alluded to.
Yeah, I think we've maybe mentioned it sort of on the side, but we haven't gone in depth. But we should. That should be an upcoming.
She said, do they kind of use the effect to increase productivity in a sustainable way? And so what kind of business or applied considerations does this thing actually have? So how are we using this is how I understand it. And Gina, the best thing that I could find for you specifically last night in the studio staying up was this thing called the actively caring model. It's probably the closest thing that you're looking for, but it's not for the bystander effect. So it was largely used for occupational safety, started around the late 60s, around the same time. It looks like it might have been influenced since the publication started around the same time, but it's not at the heart of this bystander effect. So we'll definitely include some links to that as well.
Can you say a little bit more about the actively caring model
yes,
and what
yes.
it means?
Oh my gosh. So the idea essentially to kind of, again, I feel like I'm overgeneralizing this, but it's a whole 50 years of research line, is they were trying to figure out how they could get people to identify workplace safety issues and is part of it, but as well as say something or do something about it. And generally this line of literature looks at like, how do we prevent things by getting people to do the good things as opposed to not doing the things that are bad.
So it's sort of saying like everyone who's part of an organization, asking them to sort of take some amount of responsibility for when you notice something, like actively contribute to solving a safety issue.
Yeah, or preventing it. So
right, okay.
From the workplace, we know that people can, there's a lot of kind of correctiveness that happens, right?
Right. So like feedback on what you're doing wrong.
Yeah, and we don't like those sort of things. And largely this area of organizational behavior management is found. And what I like about it is like you need to focus on the proactive things that you do want to see instead of that. And so this actively caring model really resonates with that. So if it came, for example, like a workplace safety, maybe you're in a place where you need to be wearing gloves in case an emergency happens. So let's say you have an EMT, right? I'm not going to provide just negative feedback when I don't see gloves. I'm going to reward to some extent when I see gloves are actively being used, or even better, the preventative of like they are there and available. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So yeah, that was the closest thing I could find, Gina. It does not clearly bring over, sorry, but that's what I found.
And so also bringing it back to, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of the fight, flight, or freeze, which I think I said fright earlier. Anyway, fight, flight, or freeze. And so this refers to, initially there was this thing called fight or flight. And what that means is in a situation that is you're experiencing anxiety or stress or danger, your response is to either engage with the thing that is causing that feeling, to like attack it, the fight, to get away from it, the flight, or to just move, like stay still and do nothing. And this sort of is talked about in the cognitive literature in a way of as it being that when there is a chance that you when you're coping with danger, that is you're like handling it, you're getting rid of it. That's the fight. When you are trying to get away from it and just escape, that's the flight. And that's when you feel like you feel like there is a way for you to escape. So the way they talk about it is when you're more likely to try and escape. And if you do not feel like you can escape, or you're hoping that you will go unnoticed, then you'll freeze. And so that's the three ways they sort of talk about it. And I think another way to talk about this is fight is in a situation where the thing that you are motivated by is ending that situation by you causing that situation to end. So sort of you're taking action to make it stop. And then the flight is the situation where the motivation for you is to just make it go away by getting as far away from it as possible, by putting, increasing distance or whatever between you and the thing. And then the freeze is when you're simply motivated to minimize the amount of damage that you're going to take. as much as possible. And so those are, I think, some just different ways of talking about where the motivation lies with respect to those phenomenon, rather than just when you're thinking about this, and more like in a freeze situation, escape isn't really an option for some reason. Attack isn't really an option for some reason. So to try and minimize the amount of damage that might happen, it's just, don't move sort of thing. Okay.
Cool. Well said.
All right. Ready to take this home?
I am. So one thing that we're getting used to is we actually polled all of the Facebook community to say, what do you think? I missed. So you just nicely hit Shane Spikers. So thank you for that. We did not address at the right time, but Miranda, our own Miranda as well, that helps us with editing.
Yay, Miranda.
Yeah.
Shout out to Miranda.
Asked us to just kind of like lay out what we did with the kitty.
The kitty
details.
Genovese's.
Yeah. Just that there was a lot more than just what was originally reported. And so I think we did that justice. Thank you for that. The last one was Matt Sequoia of the Behavioral Observations podcast.
Yeah, shout out to the Behavioral Observations podcast.
Yeah, he's been super generous in shouting us out as well.
Yeah, we owe you one.
And so he was excited for us to dive into this topic since it was really looking at, they were originally trying to really, I guess, get at how do we measure this effect, right?
Yeah, right.
That was
Yeah,
kind of his shout out. So
great.
Thank you for that. So thank you for all the support and the engagement. We're going to make sure we link everybody into those sort of things. Your overall take homes for the episode, though?
Yeah. So although this effect, the bystander effect, it can be observed in certain circumstances, it's more complicated than it seems, that it's not just the number of people, that there are a lot of other factors to consider, including those personal factors. And the examples seem to be relatively rare where it really exists, and that the primary variable seems to be just the number of people. And the opposite of this has happened in many instances as well, where you get some of that heroic effect from some people. And then the last thing is just that, and as I sort of mentioned, the psychological experience of each person is important when we're trying to understand how someone makes a decision in that type of situation, and how the circumstances of that event is going to be perceived and related to by you as a bystander, and the other people that are around you.
Perfect.
Cool.
So that is our episode, right?
Yeah.
That's what we had to say about that. Let's listen to some ads, and then we'll be back with an update about bystander effect. Okay, Shane, let's talk about this thing that you found called pluralistic ignorance.
So in the episode, you guys talked about this briefly. It was from Zimbardo and some folks. And so
Sure.
I wanted to kind of see if people were discussing this. And apparently there are some new studies on this, which I thought was really cool. As we mentioned in the episode, pluralistic ignorance was the kind of the new term they were trying to use for bystander effect. But Sargent and Newman in 2021 actually conducted a scoping review, which is different than a meta-analysis I learned recently.
Cool.
One day we'll have to talk about those.
Let's.
And so they dove into work being done on this pluralistic ignorance topic. So over 20 years, they found 60 articles that had been published on the topic. They found that across those topics, though, there was some variation in measurement, variation in topics that were assessed, and variations in measurement and methods of assessing. So basically what they said was they are a very long way from turning this into an actual theory or study or a topic within psychology that's like more formalized and more structured.
Yeah, so many studies are like, nobody's ever done it this way before. And that can be useful, but also like, can we replicate the things that have been done before so that we're confident in those results? Because that also is important.
Multiple ways to go about that.
Yeah. D'Souza and Schmader, that's a fun name, in 2022 basically examined the perception that men do not intervene due to pluralistic ignorance. They found that most often people underestimate men's private perspectives and thoughts about a subject, and that misunderstanding can actually reduce allyship. But they also found that men who scored high on masculine scales were also less likely to engage in allyship behaviors toward women. So, the incel community, not particularly helpful in these types of situations.
Like not even close. So basically, in short, what that says is like men want to help, they want to jump in, but because people underestimate how they think about it, or they maybe have some perceptions on it and belief systems, it like maybe prevents them from intervening in certain situations. But those who are like more masculine, like the Andrew Tates of the world, are less likely to intervene and help women on any level. So that's kind of what we discovered there.
Got it.
Yeah.
That's fun. Let's talk about the hero effect.
There are very few terms that actually describe what people do when they jump into action. Like when I was kind of going into the research, I found terms like heroism, bystander intervention effect, altruism. They were all used to describe actions of others and how they intervene. As an example, what they did talk about from Lathrop in 1998 was they looked at locus of control as a primary factor that led to helping behavior. Basically, what they were saying was that somebody had the inner belief that one could intervene, and that was a driving factor for wanting to intervene. So basically, it had to do with more beliefs and attitudes than it did with actual environmental circumstances or contexts.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, good way to say that, because I don't actually think we've talked much about locus of control on this podcast, but it is a concept that's actually very important in the philosophy of psychology, understanding where are the factors, where are the influencing variables that contribute to how someone behaves, right?
Yeah.
You can view the locus, meaning the location of those variables being internally motivated or external or some combination of those things.
Right.
Most people like to sit on the middle and say, well, it's got to be a combination because that splits the difference between these two ideas. And there's a whole fallacy about being in the middle of things being an appropriate logical position to take. We're not going to go into that. But point being, in this case, as you were saying, is whether someone feels for themselves, whether they feel like it's within their power or not, is sort of another way of thinking about that. Levin, Philpott, Kavalenko in 2019 found that the issue of the bystander effect doesn't always hold true in circumstances where there are violent or dangerous emergencies, which is very important and something that we did talk about in this episode that you will have just heard. Simply put, it is not consistent enough in these situations to cite the bystander effect as a primary barrier to intervention, because there are times when people do, as you said, this sort of hero thing. People jump into action, even for a stranger. It depends on the circumstances, the situation, the context, the people who are there, the relationships to one another, what's going on, the relative perspective of control or authority or what have you. There's lots of things, but just saying that that particular effect being a thing doesn't account for what happens in these situations consistently enough for us to use it as a description of what happens.
Right, exactly. And there were several examples in the episode where he talked about where the man on the subway had a seizure and the person jumped in, despite there being hundreds of people, jumped in to protect that person. There are lots of examples of that happening. There was, I think, one study that said, in a situation where there are 9 to 10 bystanders, observers, at least one person in that group will intervene. Mm-hmm. That's something that you kind of see pretty consistently. I've seen that in a couple of different studies too.
Got it. There are also another very important factor here that we talked about in this discussion, and again, that we need to bring up, which is that the bystander effect is situated around a very sort of Western-centric American idea of how people behave in crowds. But America does not represent how all people behave in the entire world and these social, cultural situations. And so in a discussion around stranger relationships in China, there tends to be a great deal of suspicion. So the emergency itself is not immediately cited as an emergency because of this sort of overall general suspicion toward others.
Right. So to kind of put it in perspective and kind of compare and contrast, in the United States, the bystander effect is more so somebody else will do it, so I don't need to. Right? That's kind of what the kind of the flavor of bystander effect is here. But in China, they're saying, I'm not going to intervene because that's probably a trick. I don't know those people. They're trying to dupe me or get me into a bad situation. So there is a different kind of motivation and perspective for why people avoid intervening in those situations.
And I mean, on that, it's important to point out that I think in the United States, that is something that has shifted over time because people have used emergency situations to lure victims.
Yeah.
Ted Bundy very famously would act as if he needed help, and then someone would not bystander effect come in to help him, and that's how he would apprehend some of his victims.
Right.
Now, in those cases, most of them were not in a crowd. That's part of why it worked. But nevertheless, people have specifically essentially hoodwinked people by feigning these emergency accident type situations. And so people start to become suspicious of it. It's terrible that we are that way, that has happened, because the people have sort of ruined what social cooperation we may have had in some of the situations. And it's not ubiquitous, but it has happened. So I think people have wised up to that a little bit.
Right. Absolutely. Now, some Indian researchers, specifically Ashish Nandi, notes that due to a, quote, increased brutalization of society, it's actually led to a cultural shift from choosing to help others and moving toward a more isolationist perspective. So basically, as things get worse as a society, and this is specific to India, they were saying that in this particular area that kind of living is so brutal and so difficult that helping others is not on the minds or like of interest for other people. So they're less likely to intervene because they're just dealing with such harsh circumstances in some spaces.
Got it. Okay. Some interesting things. The term bystander effect also refers to the ability of cells affected by irradiation to convey manifestations of damage to other cells not directly targeted for irradiation. That was a direct quote. Basically, if a cell is damaged through radiation, it can communicate to other non-damaged cells the same damage that they have. This is partially how radiation treatment works for cancer treatment,
right?
In a sense. For all of our microbiologist friends, listeners out there, and maybe med students, oncology med students, perhaps.
Yeah.
You may have heard that term differently than how we've used it today.
Yeah. Essentially, like the way that I understand it, and of course, this is a psychology podcast, not an oncology podcast, but my understanding is you take one cell, you irradiate it, and that cell turns to all the cells around it and goes, "You're damaged too," and the other cells around it go, "Ah, damn it!" That's how it breaks down the tumor, essentially. It's like you isolate singular cells inside the tumor, and then those cells just tell everybody else that they're broken and then breaks down the tumor.
So it's like a Trojan horse Oprah. It's like, and you get a damage, and you get a damage.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it does. I mean, that's the way I read it, and that's what the diagram said. The diagram was really helpful for understanding too. Pictures are really helpful,
for sure. Not so helpful in a podcast audio medium. But
not so much.
You can Google it. There you go.
Yeah, or maybe one day we'll do braincasts. It'll be great.
Ooh, that sounds like fun.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's what we have to say on following up on this discussion of the bystander effect. Anything else that you need to add before we move on to our recommendations, Shane?
I think that there's not been much advancement on the topic in 5 years or so. So I think we're okay.
Fair enough. Well, as always, thank you to my previous co-host, Ryan, for recording that. Thank you for recording with me today, Shane.
Of course.
Thank you to my amazing team. Justin is our audio engineer and producer. Emma Wilson is our social media coordinator, and then writing and fact-checking from Shane and myself. And of course, thank you so much for listening. If you like to support what we've done, you can join us on Patreon, leave a rating and review, subscribe, buy some merch from our merch store. Maybe we'll do some kind of Black Friday sale type thing.
Ooh.
Have a really awesome and happy holidays. And you can go tell all your family members, be like, hey, listen to this, check out this great podcast that you'll definitely love. And maybe steer them away from the more politically oriented ones if it's, they don't really lead in the same direction we do at first, and then they'll warm into them, and then they'll change their ways. Unlikely, but here's hoping.
It's worth a shot.
Those people who have already joined us on Patreon and they get all kinds of perks and benefits from doing so, we'd like to say our deepest and most sincere thank you to Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, and Ashley. You guys, thank you. We just could not do this without you at all.
Like, thank you so much for real.
Yes, for real, for real. And with that, we do have some recommendations for you.
We do, as we always do.
Recommendations.
Over the last couple of days, and this is one reason I really like Spotify, is because every now and again it'll give you this playlist, and you go and you're like, every song on this playlist is a banger. It's all rippers, no skippers, as my friends say. And so one that came up, and I was reminded that like I really enjoy just really good hip hop. And so an album that came up on that list was De La Soul's 3 Feet High and Rising. So if you're not familiar with De La Soul, you've heard the songs, you know who they are, like, because they were, I feel like, as pervasive as like Tribe Called Quest and Nas and all those groups that were coming up in New York in like the early 90s. And so, or like late 80s, early 90s in that realm. De La Soul is a time warp when you listen to it. Like when you listen to 3 Feet High and Rising, it's a perfect hip hop album. It's got all the really great samples, the real mellow beats. It's a very good like skate record. If you like to go like skateboarding, it kind of has like a cruise type of feel to it. Yeah, go listen to it. It's a perfect hip hop album.
Good to know. I will say, following up on your recommendation for the Blink-182 album, that was a great recommend. Been loving that album.
It's so good.
I'll second that. Shane gives good music recommendations. Listen to him.
I try.
I'm recommending a movie. Is a sort of recent one of those mystery spy movies. Kenneth Branagh I think this is the third one of these they've done. He did like the Murder on the Orient Express remake. This one's called The Haunting in Venice. So it's got sort of a supernatural theme-ish to it. It's really not as central to the mystery. Like it's kind of the theme that carries the plot along. A lot of critics didn't seem to care for it, but they wrote interesting things in their reviews that were like, they gave it like a 6 out of 10 and said, this was great, I hope they make another one, which confused me. Others who didn't like how Kenneth Branagh portrayed the main character. I'm not familiar with the stories well enough to have that criticism. So I think if you're just in it for like a good time mystery that's like well executed, well shot, well acted, good script, I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. And I think most people will too. Unless you're a critic, maybe you won't enjoy it. But I think most normal people who aren't looking out for that sort of thing will find a lot of fun and enjoyment in this. So you can check out A Haunting in Venice. And then Shane's recommendation, De La Soul, 3 Feet High and Rising.
Yeah,
those are my recommendations.
I love it.
Anything else that you'd like to add or anything that we need to say before we wrap this up?
I think that about covers it.
Cool. All right. Thanks so much for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.